Ibrahim. He was a former student president at Glasgow University. He was a UK UN youth delegate and currently an investment banker in HSBC. Second, we have Rosalind Skill. Rosalind is a BBC youth climate reporter. She is an ambassador for Friends of the Earth, and she studied French and Spanish at Cambridge University. Next, we have Mohammed Osman. Mohammed is a logistics analyst at Jaguar Land Rover, and he worked with the G7 for climate change. And finally, we have Emily Vernal. Emily is on the Youth Advisory Panel of the Global Centre of Adaptation, and she's currently doing her Masters at Cambridge for Development Studies. So just a special thank you to the Climate Registry for making this event happen. So let's dive straight into it. Our first question for the panelists is the youth well represented at COP26? So Amir, shall we start with you?
Well, thank you very much, Emer, for that introduction. And I would just like to say it's a pleasure to be here today as a youth representative here at the summit. And I, yes, feel very honoured for this opportunity. In relation to youth representation at COP26, I think from feedback that we have had from various country delegations, various NGOs from around the world, and certainly private businesses, there has been anecdotal feedback that has outlined that there's been greater representation for youth at this COP than any other previously. So this is our first COP, in attendance, and certainly, so we only have anecdotal, if you will, precedent to base that upon. I think certainly what we have observed is that from a structural perspective, there are certainly ways that youth representation and, more importantly, youth input could be improved through processes at future COPs. So I would say that's something that can certainly be worked upon. But in relation to presence, we have certainly met quite a number of youth representatives from around the world over this COP.
Thank you, Amir. And Rosalind, do you feel like you're seeing the young people walking around COP26?
Yeah, I think Amir put it really well. I think that there are young people who are about, but it is like questionable to what extent they're involved in like decision making and whether that participation is meaningful in any way. So I think there's a lot to unpack in terms of like, yeah, we can see young people walking around the pavilion, for example, but like, what are they doing? What are they actively involved in? And like, how does that manifest itself in the decision making process and in the climate negotiations that are ongoing?
Thank you, Rosalind. Mohammed?
Just effectively to echo what these people have said is yes, it depends on what lens you look at. If you're looking at whether there are young people at this event, yes, there are. We've got us, we've got our amazing audience, we have youth organizations that have come in. But if you're talking about engagement at a structural level, influence in decision making or negotiation, being in the room, then no. On Youth Engagement Day and the Public Engagement Day, there were more youth members outside protesting about the lack of youth engagement than there were, I think, people in the pavilion itself, let alone young people. So yes, it is better than COPs before. Yes, there are people here. Yes, we are having amazing conversations with businesses and state leaders and local leaders, but being in the room, being in the decision-making room, having the influence or the access to be able to have an impact on public policy, no, that's still a severe lack.
Okay. Thank you. And Emily?
Thank you very much, Emma. I think to completely echo what these three have said, that there is this real difference. Even if you do get a young person in a room, sometimes they are given seats at negotiation tables if they're with a party delegation or with a specific constituency, but often those young people haven't been given the skills and the training to actually be able to engage in the decision making in a way that's effective. The language of the negotiations and of the UNCCC framework is highly technical, and it requires quite in-depth knowledge of how these negotiations work. So I think a lot of young people coming here, particularly us for the first time, it's a lot about figuring out how the process works. Like, how does COP actually work? How do we reach these ambitious climate agreements that we so desperately are seeking? And I think if young people come to COP without this prior knowledge of how to engage and who they should be talking to make a difference. It just means that they may get a seat at the table, but once they've got that seat, how do they use that seat effectively? And I think that's maybe where the gap is.
That's a good point about, you know, the language that's used, and can young people understand it, and how can they, you know, input into that language. That's perfect. Now I want to ask is, we're talking about, you know, are we seeing the young people here? I want to know, why do you think it's important that young people are here? You know, why does it matter that the young people are involved? Rosalind, do you want to start off?
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think it's like highly critical, because ultimately, like, the decisions that are made here are shaping our future. So I think, like, we're the ones who are going to be inhabiting the planet, so it makes sense that then we're involved in some level of the decision making process. And I think that young people also bring like an incredible energy and enthusiasm. I think that intergenerational collaboration is really important as well. But regarding like this question of intergenerational justice and social justice, I think it's like only right that young people should be involved and should be like participating. So yeah, I think it's like very, very important.
Mohammed?
I think, to put it bluntly, we're inheriting the planet that the older generation are leaving to us. So all the decisions that are being made here, all the agreements in 2030 and 2050 and 2060, those are going to be the years in which we are grown up, whether or not we decide to have children. That's the world that we're all going to live in. And we bring this very different and diverse perspective that people in politics that have been in the industry for 30 or 40 years might have had washed out of them. We're running around at 6 a.m. here today. We have an energy and a drive and a passion and an ambition to give 100% of our being into this, because this is our future. To be as blunt as possible, we're inheriting this planet, and it's only right that we have an input, or we have a voice, because this is the 26th COP. How many conferences or parties do we need to have to put a stop to these things? And evidently, if the older generation are not doing it, then we need to be given a seat at the table.
Good point, Mohammed. Emily, yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think we're the largest like generation of youth in history. So there's more young people than ever before. And I think if they're excluded from the decision making and they are not involved in the process, you're missing out a huge proportion of the global population. And therefore any decision that's made just won't be representative. So just in the purely democratic sense, that there needs to be young people involved at all stages of the process, from the design of the policies to the implementation on the ground. I think it's not just getting youth to COP, but it's making sure there's youth in local leadership positions for climate, and youth in business positions where they're implementing sustainability policies. Like, we could have youth everywhere. And I think the other question is also, why is it, like, if we flip the question around, not like why aren't youth involved, but like why are we still having to kind of silo, oh, there's youth involvement? It should just be young people are people. And why is that not considered like the same expertise as someone with more age and experience? I think we need to kind of address what we mean by expertise and knowledge, and realize that young people have as much to offer, and they've got different perspectives and they've got innovation. And in doing so, we're kind of just be able to mainstream youth involvement. It won't be seen as, oh, an add-on or tokenistic. Young people, if they've got something to contribute, they'll just be given an equal seat to everyone else. And I think that's so important.
Yeah, Mohammed, yeah.
I also think that question is posed by politicians and people in power to shift the sort of ownership of responsibility and the ownership of explanation and the burden of proof onto young people. We shouldn't have to justify why we're in a room. We shouldn't have to explain that we have a voice and we have an input and we've got a brain and we have ideas. The burden of that explanation shouldn't be on us. So every time I hear, should young people be that, why shouldn't they? What is it minus years on this earth that older people have that we don't have? We all been educated to a university level, most of us, and even if not, we have previous experience, we have life experience. Why are we the ones having to justify why we deserve to be in rooms?
Good point, Mohammed, yeah. And I think it's that sense of urgency. Young people feel the urgency and a lot of adults don't. And that's because you grow up in a different environment with different, priorities, I suppose, but we are thrown in at the deep end, and so that's why we are so passionate about this, because we know how serious this is. So all very good points. Thank you so much. Now I'll move on to our next question. Many young people want to take action to combat climate change on a bigger scale than just their individual decisions and their individual actions. What sector or what career path do you see or do you feel would be the best for young people to get into? Would it be politics? Would it be science? Would it be finance? What career path would be the best to make a difference? Who would like to start? Amir, yeah.
Start. I think one of the most important factors that has been exemplified through not specifically representation of youth, but the broader diaspora that are present here at COP, reflects the multi-sectoral importance of addressing this issue. So we see that whether you are a policy advocate within the environmental division of your country, whether you are a financer, whether you're an engineer, whether you're somebody that is an artist, every single person is a stakeholder in relation to driving sustainability and looking at climate change as a universal issue. So I think that in offering inspiration, guidance, and encouragement to young people, there is no one path that specifically supersedes all others in relation to where you can have an impact on this issue. Because you can have an impact in your day-to-day life, but you certainly, in whatever vocation that you choose or vocations that you choose, because another trend that is in parallel to the climate issue is that more and more of us, are not following a linear career path. So I think to try to silo or segment a particular field to say this is the professional vocation that will exclusively address climate change is a fallacy. And I think it's ultimately about offering mentorship to young people to actually help understand, technical terminology that's used. How are the decision makers addressing climate change? Because what we know from these discussions that are taking place over the course of this summit is that there has been months, if not years, of consultation with a whole plethora of advisors in every single sector, whether it's business, public policy. So that's something that young people can take, I think, some solace in, that whatever area you pursue professionally, you can have an input to climate change.
That's great, Rosalind. Thank you, Amir.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Amir. I think it's so important. Like, I come from a languages background, so I studied French and Spanish. So a massive part of my climate activism is showing, like, if you have skills which are like creativity, communication, imagination, art, that can also play a role. Because I think for so long, people who didn't come from that traditional climate science background or environmental background felt alienated, and then they struggled to engage in the movement. And I think we're now moving to a point where, as Amir says, it's a universal issue and it's touching everyone and everything. So literally what I always say to people is, like, bring whatever skills that you have. Like, I was recently involved in a climate mural in Belfast. That's an artist who's using her expertise to install a mural which is encouraging politicians in Northern Ireland to act now. So, like, in any event, in any protest, like whether it be organisation, finance, like people making the tea and coffee, the stuff that's like not glamorous and behind the scenes, like, you can bring whatever skill set you have. And I'm really glad that the discussion's moving that way, and that people are, like you were talking about expertise, Emily, people are no longer feeling like they need to be an expert, but it's this like constant state of learning and developing and growing your professional and like personal learning as well. So I would just say, yeah, I don't think there's one particular avenue, and I think people should think about the skills they have and how they can use that and bring it to the climate movement in a way that's useful.
That's brilliant, Rosalind. Thank you, Mohammed.
Just to sort of resonate, in this day and age, it doesn't matter as much what you're doing. You can engage in public and sort of business issues in any way. Yesterday, an amazing dinner, I met a lovely lady who was the previous head of the California Air and Resource Board, who has just ironically walked into the room. And when I asked her, how can young people engage with people in power? How can we make them listen? She said, go and find them, knock on their door and make them listen to you. Make sure you go with concrete plans. Tell them what you want from them. Don't say we need climate justice. Say we need you to pass this, and this, because then we get this. So it doesn't. We have an investment banker. We have a logistics person. We have someone in language. We have someone who studied history at university. None of us share anything. We have political power, the power to vote, is an incredible power that we have. We have the power of business. We can buy or not buy from organizations that don't match our sort of ideology on the world. We have influence, we have social media, we have so many avenues that we can have an impact on the world. It doesn't matter what you're doing. So you can vote, you can spend your money wisely, you can engage in certain social circles, or you can, as you amazingly put it yesterday, go to your MP, knock on his door, write him an email, and even not in Britain, go to your local state official and make sure they hear you. You sit there and you scream and you give them as much information as they possibly can need to make sure that they are aware you know what you're talking about.
That's a good point, Mohammed. Thank you. Emily?
Yeah, I'm just going to echo everything they've said because it's some fantastic answers, and just build up upon what Rosalind was saying about more an interdisciplinary approach to kind of making a difference. I think the arts and the creativity have a lot to offer. I think coming from a humanities background as well, that's something I'm really passionate about. And I think, so say you don't come from a scientific background, you can use skills like storytelling. The way that we frame the climate emergency is so important to our response as humans. Because I went to a talk the other day, and an incredible activist said, as an activist, before anything else, you are human. And I think we sometimes feel like we have to take on this personality of a politician or a diplomat or a business leader as young people when we're talking to other people we're trying to influence. But actually, we've got to speak from the heart, and we've got to speak to the real crisis. And I think storytelling and the language we use and the narratives we portray, whether that's through art or through journalism, are so important. And I think that's another way that you can influence. You can influence through writing articles like Rosie's doing, or you through murals. So I think it's just playing to your own strengths and realizing that all of these different sectors actually are working together nowadays. It's about the collaboration.
Brilliant. But I feel like a lot of young people, a lot of young activists, they won't go into politics because they feel it's toxic, feel it's corrupt. Yet it's the political will that a lot of countries are lacking in. And so surely we need more environmentalists, we need more activists in politics. How could we maybe, promote or get people to trust politics again, and to think, well, if this is what we're lacking in, well, then that's the hole we need to fill. So have you any thoughts on that? Anyone?
So again, I don't know if this comes across as a somewhat revolutionary answer, but I think that this idea of systemic change in politics and structural change is so important. And it's something that is not widely being addressed in the dialogue around how we can ensure communities are engaged with politics. I mean, I think a trend that we've seen in the democratic world, if you will, is that there's been a lack of youth representation in relation to voter turnout for quite some time. Young people are not voting. And an issue around that pertains to embedded structures that have existed for decades. Many political systems, I'm maybe speaking here from the perspective of the UK, but certainly within a number of other countries, our processes are obsolete. And this is not even incorporating how technology is influencing politics. I mean, without going into great detail, we saw 5 years ago in the US 2016 presidential election, there were serious challenges presented by modern technology. Now, whether in 2021 those challenges have been resolved, I think is a wider debate. But we are still living with the same processes that existed a century ago. And I think in relation to why young people should be involved in the dialogue, that's a very pertinent example right there. Young people should have input in relation to highlight how we vote, how we engage with politics, how politicians are held accountable. Because the processes that existed in 1901, are they suitable for 2021? But we are still supporting this same narrative. And it's not to say that it requires absolute change, but it certainly requires an update. And I think until that update happens, we will be reactive to climate change. And that's the biggest problem within many countries. It's a reactive approach and not a proactive one.
Brilliant answer, yeah. Would anyone like to add anything? I think you kind of covered a lot of here, but anyone like to add any more points?
I think this only comes to mind because we had the pleasure of meeting Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from the States yesterday, and it still happens quite rarely, but it's becoming clear now that there are people running for office that don't have to take money from big corporate donors who are trashing the Amazon or the rainforest. And so it's we're a little less forward thinking in the UK here, and people need to engage with sort of certain corporations to get the financing available to run for office. But once we as the youth use our power to vote correctly, and we know who to vote for, and we're engaging with politics on a low level, we need to get involved. That's where the decisions are made, and we can protest and we can scream and we can cry and we can do all we want, but we can't do one without the other. We're sitting here debating youth engagement. If we don't get into politics, we can't change anything. Things change from the top down, not the bottom up. So while raising awareness and protesting are amazing things, and we 100% there's space to do it, it works in tandem with getting into politics and ensuring that we're the people in the room. We're the people giving other young people, the seat at the table. Because if we're not doing it, we can't sit here and be surprised that nothing's changing. In 2101, the same things will be happening, because to change those policies, those archaic issues, we have to be in those positions. So it's something whether it's something we kind of have to get engaged in, and so we have to get involved in for us to be able to have the impact that we want to have.
Be the change that you want to see in the world, I suppose. That's it, really. Okay, so within young people, within the young generation, there's a lot of talk around eco-anxiety, eco-anger, eco-depression. And that's probably fueled by young people being so frustrated and so angry at politics and governments who are, not fulfilling promises, who are making empty words or saying empty words. What would you advise young people to do with those emotions? Because if you lock it in, I suppose it's not good for your own mental health. So would you have any advice on what to do with that anger and with that frustration? Emily, would you like to kickstart us?
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point about eco-anxiety. I attended a workshop this week at COP, run by Force of Nature, who are doing incredible work around eco-anxiety. And in a recent report that they issued, they said that it was 70% of young people that they interviewed were struggling with feelings of eco-anxiety, and that they were struggling to process the future that they were inheriting. And that's a really difficult concept. And I think perhaps something that's quite unique to our generation is growing up with this sense of anxiety about the future that perhaps wasn't there for generations when we didn't know the full extent of the climate crisis. So I think their message from the workshop was about taking this anxiety and turning it into action and turning it into agency. So I think we have to be okay. We have to acknowledge these feelings. We have to sit with these feelings, to acknowledge these feelings, and then talk about it. I think coming together in panels like this and acknowledging that a lot of young people feel this way, and that we can talk about it and create space for discussion around these things, will actually create unity, and it will create collaboration. It will build the movement of young people through this shared feelings, which we can all harness towards something that's a lot more proactive and helps us towards the cause. So I think it's about harnessing those feelings and working together to put them towards something that solves the problem.
Well said, Emily.
Thank you.
Anyone like to add their views?
I feel like I really like the phrase hope mobilizes, fear paralyzes, because I think when you do channel these feelings of eco-anxiety, and I personally haven't experienced it, so I don't like to so much speak from that perspective, because I recognize it's really crippling for some people. I think I'm a super optimist who doesn't let myself get to that point. But I think that what's really helpful is to channel that outrage into hope and optimism, and coming together in community is a massive thing. I think community is so important, and bringing people together through collaboration, like Emily was saying. But for me, the anecdote, the antidote, if you like, is hope, and getting involved in social movements and social outreach, and coming to things like this and trying to channel that energy into doing something.
And it's the people you surround yourselves with. If you're surrounded by people who don't feel the same, who don't have that, fear for the future and desire to make something happen, then that's whenever you feel alone. But it's whenever you surround yourself with people like yourselves who feel the same way, well, then that's whenever you really join the movement and feel like you're part of something much bigger than yourselves. So we've only a few questions left. Amir, I'm going to ask you, what would you see as a successful COP26? What would you like to see come out of it?
So I suppose from a personal perspective, I mean, we're currently sitting, this is my hometown within Glasgow, and I think both within the city, but also looking at the broader diaspora, I mean, what has happened here at COP26 is we have an international mass, and what I would like to see is ultimately legacy. There will be decisions taken here that will propel investment, that will look at commitments not only from individual countries but also from regions around the world. And I think that is something that is, incredibly positive. But from a grassroots and I suppose wider societal perspective, I think that the legacy of COP will also ultimately be a recognition and acknowledgement and understanding amongst communities and the public on climate change. And I think that messaging during the conference has been positive. I think with the outside world, there has been a lot of engagement, but it's looking at how that legacy and that momentum continues. I think that will be the greatest thing that can come from COP.
That's it, I suppose. This movement can't end on the 12th of November. This has to keep going, particularly say on the news. We can't be all focusing on climate change for 2 weeks and then let it drop down again. We need to keep this motion and intensity going. Anyone else like to? Rosalind?
Yeah, I think like this broader aim of like keeping 1.5 alive, like that was the number that was thrown about so much over these past 2 weeks. So hopefully keeping that in sight. Also the question of climate finance and seeing the funding go into vulnerable countries in the global south, making sure that we see that money moved. And for me, it's like keeping this question of justice right at the center of the climate negotiations, because I feel like if the decisions that are made at COP or the commitments that are made do not have justice and people at the center, then like that's not really going to serve us in a sustainable future. Looking more broadly at that question of legacy, which Amir raised, for Northern Ireland, for example, the only nation in the UK with no climate legislation, I think it's really important that we bring back our learnings from COP and hopefully channel that into pioneering a really strong climate bill with legally binding emission targets in Northern Ireland. But that's a more personal perspective. But on a broader note, this question of justice.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rosalind. Mohammed?
Glasgow, in simple terms, was supposed to deliver on the promises of Paris. And as of right now, it has fallen severely short. So the Prime Minister of Barbados did a really impactful and amazing speech on the first day in the opening ceremony. I've watched it about 5 or 6 times. And she's highlighted 3 key areas in which the Paris Agreement has fallen severely short. One major example is the promise of £100 billion. And now I believe they've only agreed to raise 80 billion. It's 20% of a fund that was supposed to support both the developed world and the developing world. The promises of having 50% of the budget go towards adaptation, and now I believe it's only at 25%. So the legacy of Glasgow, the legacy of this COP, has to be that Paris was delivered. So the only success that matters is if we keep 1.5 alive, because I believe right now the trajectory that we're heading on is at 2.4 degrees Celsius. And secondly, the main success would be ultimately if Glasgow delivered on promise. And as of right now, it's not. And it's very frustrating because you have local and state leaders begging for more support. You have the presidents and the prime ministers and the head of states of smaller countries in sort of Africa and the Atlantic and small island nations who are screaming very loudly for the support of nations that promised them 5 years ago that they'd give them everything they needed. We're not there yet. And COP26, with all its beauty and its 3 layers of security and the blue zone and all of that lovely stuff, will cease to matter the minute Friday is over if we leave Glasgow without the rigorous and tough and signed documents of all the world leaders. And as of right now, the feeling in the air is a little disappointment. But we're hoping and praying that in the last 2 days, the world leaders sort of acknowledge that Paris wasn't a nice to have. It wasn't something that, yeah, we should try and aim for it. It was the only way we survive in the way that we want to.
Paris was quite about why are we doing this, I feel. And now COP26 is about how are we going to do it and when are we going to do it. So yeah, Emily?
Yeah, I think you guys have put it perfectly, and you've really emphasized the ambition that I think is so integral to what we need to see from the final commitments of Glasgow. And I think, to echo what Rosalind said, I think the justice narrative, like leaving no one behind within the commitments, is something that is really important. In my perspective of what a successful Glasgow would be, I think, and that's going back to the seat at the table narrative. It's ensuring that gender is mainstreamed, it's ensuring that youth is mainstreamed, it's ensuring that Indigenous peoples have had their say on what's important, and we're looking at kind of Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, as well as this kind of more scientific and technical knowledge within the commitments. So I think for me that the justice narrative has to be absolutely at the centre, and also the funding for adaptation is really key. I think that's going to help us take a more proactive response, and it's going to help us act now, and I think that kind of shows the urgency we need.
Perfect. Thank you so much. One more question. In one word, can you describe your experience so far at COP26? Amir, one word.
I would say motivational. I think I've really felt motivated to continue in this journey.
Thank you, Amir. Rosalind, one word to describe your experience. Optimist. Optimist.
Optimist.
Insightful.
Collaboration.
Thank you so much. Brilliant words to describe your experience so far. That is us, folks. Thank you so much for joining both virtually and live to our youth engagement event, Mapping the Present and Owning the Future. Thank you to our panellists, Amir, Rosalind, Mohammed and Emily. You've been fantastic. I think you are really representative of how young people are feeling. And as you say, we need the power of the youth and power to the people, and we can see that that's how you are all feeling. So thank you again, and keep up the good work, everyone.
Thank you, Emer.
Thank you.